2018 when I was able to come out there and do a little presenting. I'm really hoping today that we really get the opportunity to hear some of the specific concerns that you guys are having. But I did put together some slides that I was hoping to just go through because I do think that this information is really important as a foundation when determining kind of what causes a behavior to happen. So I'm screen sharing. I'm just gonna kind of start at the beginning and kind of work my way through. It's a small enough group though that if you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. I would rather you ask it right then than forgetting it and not being able to ask it. So please feel free to jump in if you have questions more urgently, okay? All right. So I want to start out with just talking more generally about behaviors within the context of Down syndrome. And, you know, it's important to kind of note that the types of things that I'm going to talk about are things that are important for not just Down syndrome, but generally when we talk about behaviors. But it becomes even more relevant within the context of Down syndrome because of the neurodevelopmental differences that we see within this condition. So, okay. You know, as Lauren mentioned, I am super fortunate to work for the C Center for Down Syndrome, which you'll see here in one of the circles. But we are not just the C Center for Down Syndrome providing pediatric medical care and clinical research. We are fortunate enough to be affiliated with a lot of other groups that have all unique, you know, specific things that they do related to Down syndrome. So we have Global Down Syndrome Foundation that does fundraising and really funds our center so we get to do the work that we get to do. They do outreach, advocacy, they have some community-based programs, they provide education. So they, you know, do a lot of different things and they fundraise specifically for our clinic. We're affiliated with the Cernic Institute for Down Syndrome. They do basic research, clinical research, the most amazing scientists that I have ever met and really have done some you know, critical work in Down syndrome research to identify, you know, the interferon specific components of Down syndrome. We're affiliated with Alzheimer's and the Cognition Center, and there is a adult Down syndrome clinic at one of our partner hospitals that also provides adult medical care and primary care, and they do some clinical research as well. So the objectives for today, I tried to keep it pretty simple, but I do want to review the areas of the brain that impact behavior. I want to connect the brain differences to the expression of these differences in day-to-day life. I want to, you know, help you guys to learn to look at behaviors a little more analytically. And we're going to spend the majority of our time doing this. And I'd love to hear your concerns so that we can actually look at those as also being, you know, ways to come up with specific solutions. We're going to identify strategies and interventions to address these challenging behaviors. Okay. So you'll notice, because it's late in the day, that every single one of my slides is unique. And I kind of figured that that would be a good way to keep you guys on your toes and make sure you're paying attention. So let's just start out with talking a little bit about brain development in Down syndrome. And again, one of the reasons I like to talk about this is because we spend a lot of time talking about the medical issues that kids with Down syndrome have. We talk a lot about the learning issues that kids with Down syndrome have. We talk about the strengths in, you know, social engagement, in receptive language, but we really don't talk about like where all that comes from. And I do think that, you know, how the brain works is actually a big part of what you see when you see behaviors arising. So it's important to know that at or just before birth, the brain of an individual with Down syndrome is almost the same as a brain of an individual without any genetic differences or anomalies. The differences that we start to notice actually show up around 3 to 5 months of age, and we see definite differences in the brain structure by 6 months of age. And then once the brain of a person with Down syndrome is mature, you know, like so completely developed, that person's brain is about 20% smaller than average, and they have fewer neurons or the little communication stems in the brain, as well as like connections that, you know, are a little bit abnormal in how they form between these cells. And so, think about things like if you, are trying to get from point A to point B. If you go in a straight line, the information moves much more quickly. If you try to go from A to B and you kind of take a really, really crazy roundabout way to get there, it's going to take that information longer, take you longer to get from point A to point B. And so if you think about how things develop, if those neurons have to go farther to transport information from one neuron to another, then what you're going to have is somebody who's processing information much more slowly than the average person. And so we see that happening. The other piece that we see in those differences in connections is that a process called myelination is interrupted. The way that I like to describe that is essentially moving from dial-up internet to high-speed internet. And so when the brains of any child develop, each of those neurons develops this sheath or develops this kind of cover around the neurons, and that conducts electricity much faster than if you don't have that. This is interrupted in people with Down syndrome, in not the whole brain and in certain parts of the brain. And again, it'll feel relevant as we kind of talk more and more about how that translates into behaviors. So the areas of the brain that are affected include the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory, working memory, which is like holding information in your brain and then doing something with it. For example, if I gave you guys a 7-digit number, you'd be able to hold that information until I asked you to repeat it back. For people with Down syndrome, this is impacted because of that circuitry issue and that myelination issue that I mentioned before. Learning is also a part of that hippocampus piece. And so that means, like, how many repetitions does it take for a person to move information from short-term memory to long-term memory? And so if you sometimes hear people saying, like, man, my kiddo with Down syndrome, it seems like they understood and they learned that yesterday, or they could tell me like their numbers 1 to 5 yesterday, but now they can't. We might get frustrated, with them, but the reality is that could be an issue with encoding that information into long-term memory. So it really is like Groundhog's Day for them with that specific, piece of information. A second part of the brain is called the prefrontal cortex. It's kind of like the front part of your brain, and it's responsible for higher level cognitive tasks. So like planning what you're going to do, in a day, decision making. So knowing kind of what information you need to take in order to make a decision, problem solving. This one I think is really interesting. I think about, like, you might notice that if your child has a problem and you are really relying on them to do trial and error and try a couple of different strategies, a child with Down syndrome might try the same strategy over and over again, even if it's not effective. And we might get frustrated, like, hello, like, why aren't you trying a different strategy? But that's really part of that circuitry issue, in that problem solving is really challenging. And so, our kids kind of sometimes tend to be much more repetitive in how they try to solve a problem instead of coming up with an alternative solution. And when we talk about strategies on how to address that, I'll make mention of, telling telling a child with Down syndrome what to do instead of what not to do, to help them to kind of move past whatever that behavior is. And we can talk about that a little more. Personality expression, I would say mood regulation is a part of the prefrontal cortex. So you may notice sometimes that it feels like, and a lot of families actually mentioned this, kind of like children who get really physically aggressive when they're angry, or they might kind of have a bigger reaction to something than the situation actually, warrants. And, that can be pretty frustrating. But again, this could be related to that circuitry issue in the prefrontal cortex. So it kind of is almost like you don't have an emotion filter. And whenever you experience that emotion, it kind of happens way bigger and way more dramatically than it would for somebody who has a little bit more of that filter. Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that doesn't develop over time. It just means that that you're going to see much more reactivity, for individuals with Down syndrome compared to their neurotypical peers that might be the same age. This part's also responsible for, like, impulse control. So, again, pausing before reacting. And so, at a later point in time, we'll talk about kind of mental health issues too that kind of can overlay on all of this. Some kids with Down syndrome have, impulse control issues because it's just developmentally where they are, while other kids might have impulse control issues because they have a secondary diagnosis of ADHD. It really takes a skilled clinician to be able to make that differentiation, but sometimes, I think, if you are concerned, it's kind of something important to bring up, especially with a primary care physician, because there are other interventions that might be helpful to address that. The third part of the brain is the cerebellum. It's kind of like a more primitive part of your brain, and it's responsible for coordination of movement and learning and attention and language. So it kind of has some overlap with the prefrontal cortex, but also has some things that are unique to it. Think about when, you are supposed to say, like, imitate an action, or say that it's something like you need to start doing something. Your brain communicates to the rest of your body, and then your body tells you to kind of move or to act on whatever it is that you've heard or what you've seen. For kids with Down syndrome, it might, we already have that slower processing of information that we talked about earlier because of myelination and kind of the wiring being a little bit less efficient. But then the other part is that there's a slowness in the translation from here, I heard this information, to now I need to coordinate my movements and actually do something with it. What we know about these neurodevelopmental differences in individuals with Down syndrome, as you can imagine, no two people with Down syndrome are exactly alike. But what we do know from a lot of research is that people with Down syndrome typically are more likely to show one or more of these characteristics or behaviors related to their brain functioning, but that doesn't mean that every single one will express those issues in the same way. So we call this a probabilistic behavioral phenotype, meaning that it's highly probable or highly likely that a child with Down syndrome will have these challenges, but to varying degrees, like I said, because everyone's different. So when we think about the expression of these brain differences, we see something called relative strengths, and we see something called relative weaknesses or relative challenges. We say relative strengths because it doesn't mean that they are strengths compared to other typical children. It means that they are strengths compared to the things that individuals with Down syndrome might have a harder time with. So our individuals with Down syndrome have more likely or have intact implicit memory, which is kind of like your procedural memory. So it's your ability to remember routines or remember schedules or remember kind of how to do something once you've learned and encoded that, right? So it doesn't mean like memory for facts. It means like being able to understand things that are more practical that you do on a daily basis. Visual spatial memory is a relative strength. So where things are placed. I would actually say for a lot of the kids I work with, it might be to a fault. In that they become very particular and kind of a little bit, maybe even a little bit obsessive about where something needs to be, and that if it doesn't look right or if it's not in that place, then we might get a little frustrated or we might have a behavior as a result. Visual processing, so being able to either read the room or being able to process information that you see versus that you hear. And you may have heard that, or you may have read that people with Down syndrome are visual learners. And I put that in air quotes a little bit because what that really means is that the visual processing, or when you present information visually, it compensates for some of the areas of challenge that I'm going to note later on. Meaning, like, if I mentioned that working memory part for the hippocampus, if I can't hold information in my head, how can I successfully do what somebody's asking me to do? I can't. But if I visually have it presented like a visual schedule, then I'm much more likely to have a reference tool to be able to kind of look back and go, oh, what is it that I need to be doing right now, or what do I need to do next? So it allows our kids to be more successful in completing things without having behaviors. Visual motor integration, so being able to like follow models, like so being able to watch and then do things that are observed. Receptive language skills, so you'll see that expressive language compared to receptive language is impacted, but receptive language, our kids actually do pretty well with understanding how someone communicates to them within the realm of what their language capacity is. So if I'm sitting and I'm explaining the reason why a child has to do something and I spend like, you know, half an hour explaining the reason, that's not going to be good receptive language skill use. It's actually going to make somebody really confused, and they're going to have a hard time knowing what information is relevant and what's not. And then you end up seeing kind of the pretty big challenging behaviors as a result. Social emotional functioning is more intact, or it's a relative strength. So our kids really read emotions well, and particularly related to facial expressions. Now, the interesting thing about that is that every strength can also be a weakness, right? So say, for example, you give a child a direction and they don't respond right away, perhaps because we didn't give them enough time to process. And then the next time we repeat ourselves, we raise our voice, we change our facial expression, and we say it again, or we, make it kind of even more firm. Now, all of a sudden, because our kids are so good at that social emotional functioning and reading these emotions, what will happen is they'll start ignoring the words that you're saying, and they'll be responding to your facial expressions, which might actually make it harder for them to even follow the directions that you're giving. Our kids tend to be more interested and motivated by others than a child who might have a secondary diagnosis of autism, or even some neurotypical children, and so that would be a relative strength as well. Visual imitation, simply watching and imitating, our kids are really good at that. Again, I've said certain things are strengths, certain things are challenges, and what I would say is that that's one of the pushes for having kids in an inclusive environment, is watching peer models that are engaging in appropriate behaviors, whereas sometimes we have kids who are in self-contained classrooms, or in situations where they're with other children with different types of needs, and there might be a likelihood of increased behavioral challenges, and we don't want our kids to be modeling that. So the challenges that we see in those brain differences are that our kids have problems with explicit memory, or things, and the way that I like to say it is things that don't feel immediately pertinent. So if I ask a child with Down syndrome to memorize certain facts and events that don't have kind of emotional, value, then what I might end up doing is they might not be able to remember it, right? Like historical facts, things like that, versus facts or events related to something fun that they did with their family members. They might be able to remember that, but this is more referring to things that don't have kind of an emotional attachment or don't have kind of meaning in that way. Our kids have poor auditory and verbal working memory. So I mentioned to you guys that the hippocampus has a hard time with holding information in a person's brain and then executing something with it. And so verbal information is even more challenging for our kids, because what happens? Once you say something, it disappears, right? And so what we rely on is our working memory, so that when somebody says something, we kind of hold all of the steps in our head and we repeat them, and then we do them as we're still remembering. But for individuals with Down syndrome, because of that hippocampus issue that I mentioned earlier, our kids can't hold that information. And so when we say that they're poor auditory and verbal working memory, that they have poor auditory and working memory, what that really means is that they can hear those things, but have a really hard time remembering what was said because of that, kind of broken working memory piece. Verbal processing, so following directions verbally can be hard. Same reason as the one I just said above. Slower motor coordination and response time. So if you give an instruction and the person doesn't start following it, it could be that they're just not that they just don't want to do what you're asking them to, or that that's not their preference. But it could also be that they just need to have a little bit more time to let the information get from hearing the information, processing the information, sending that signal to your cerebellum that I mentioned is responsible for motor coordination, and then actually acting on that. And it's different for everyone, so I couldn't necessarily tell you it's exactly 10 seconds or exactly 8 seconds. But that's a part of the beauty of being able to observe kids and to see what their specific challenge might be. Expressive language skills. So because of the oral motor and facial structure of individuals with Down syndrome, they have a harder time with verbalizing information versus using alternative methods. So we see a smaller vocabulary, we see, or underdeveloped vocabulary, we see an underdeveloped ability to kind of put words together in a meaningful way, things like that. I mentioned earlier that the prefrontal cortex, or the part of the brain that's responsible for problem solving, is impacted in individuals with Down syndrome. So, finding an alternative. If you've tried to problem solve one way and it doesn't work, being able to find a different way to try is really challenging for our kids. Interestingly enough, persistence with a problem and motivation, for trying to, overcome a challenging task is also difficult for our kids. And so they're more likely to give up on those things. Now, there's not necessarily research on why that is specifically, if it's like neurologically wired that way, or if it has to do with, the difficulty of some of the tasks, like, fine motor skills and how that might impact that. But there's actually an interesting research article that I read that happened a while ago, but was really interesting to me. And so basically what they did was they put a group of kids with Down syndrome in a room, with a confederate or a person who, was there for this research study, and they gave the child a puzzle. And so they matched that with a group of kids who were basically developmentally around the same age. And so, I don't know if you can imagine this, but what ended up happening was that the kids with Down syndrome, who were developmentally around the same age as the kids with Down syndrome, would kind of keep trying to solve the puzzle until it was solved, or they would ask for help. The individuals with Down syndrome in the research study essentially would use their social savvy to try and like get out of doing the puzzle. So they might crawl into the examiner's lap, they might, draw their attention to something else, but the idea is that persistence wasn't there. It was and the motivation for the social interaction was much higher than the motivation for trying to complete the puzzle. So on top of having these neurological differences in the brain that I mentioned, our kids actually also go through typical changes. So they go through the same developmental stages that kids without Down syndrome go through, like the terrible twos, or puberty, or a phase of like everything being about them. So me, or I do it. So our kids with Down syndrome actually go through those same, developmental stages. But what happens, because of their existing developmental delay, they occur at a much later age. So I know that on the list, a lot of people mentioned throwing behaviors. And oh my gosh, it's so stressful to have to keep seeing throwing behaviors happening. And so what I would argue is that we have to see whether throwing behavior is developmentally appropriate for their age, meaning that it's a phase that all kids go through, or if there's something more to it. And obviously you have to work kind of with a professional to figure that out, but I'm going to hopefully give you some tools to try and figure that out yourself as well. So imagine that a typically developing child might start doing throwing behaviors when they're under 12 months, right? So they're sitting, on a blanket, and they, maybe let's even say 6 months, sitting on a blanket, and they're, kind of like taking items that they're done with, and they kind of throw them. Well, if you're 6 months old, you're not going to throw very far, and you're probably not going to be able to reach things that are very far away in order to pick them up and throw them. Now, if we think about kids with Down syndrome who would have a developmental delay, and they might not go through that phase of throwing until they're much older or their bodies are bigger. And what happens, as you can imagine, is I can throw farther and I can reach more things to throw. On top of that, our kids might also have this other piece where they might have some delays in their play skills. And so they kind of don't know what to do with a toy, and they end up throwing those things more frequently as well. I promise we'll talk more about like how to address that specifically, but I like to think about how that illustrates how something that's really typical development can be problematic for kids with Down syndrome, surely because the developmental stage is happening at a later point in time. And so all of this stuff, makes it meaningful that we have to approach behaviors from a developmental perspective because of that. I put this graph on here just to kind of give you an example of how those developmental trajectories and how that change can happen. So you see that there's growth happening in language milestones for typical kids, and then there's growth happening for kids with Down syndrome for language development as well. But you can see that the language development happens at much later age than for a typical child. And I will tell you that in one of our research projects, we did identify that the kids who had, more significant behavioral challenges were ones who had more significant language issues. And so I think that's an important thing to take into consideration, because you may not be able to resolve the behavioral problem without, actually addressing, giving a child a way to communicate what they're struggling with or what they're trying to do. So on top of all of this stuff, then we have setting events. Setting events, and I can send this checklist to you guys if it's of interest. It's actually a couple pages long. But setting events are things that are not directly related to a behavior, but they still impact our kids or impact anybody. So sometimes there are things like sleep, and for kids with Down syndrome who have a higher rate of having obstructive sleep apnea, that could definitely impact behaviors. Some of our kids have psychiatric conditions, which do exist in Down syndrome, ADHD, anxiety, some behavioral disorders. But if you think about those also, that may not seem like they're affecting a behavior immediately, but they certainly are impacting the behavior overall. So I think it's important to kind of think about those things. Some other things are like, was there a change in medication? Did a person miss a meal? And so it's important to not only look at what happens right before a behavior occurs, which is probably what you guys have heard a lot about, but to also kind of look at the overall profile or the umbrella issues that might also impact behaviors. So how does this knowledge intersect with behaviors? So if we have a higher demand versus your ability to cope, you have more behaviors. If you're chronically at a higher state of anxiety, because you're in a situation where you're processing information more slowly and people, are kind of going high speed versus the pace that you would prefer, you are not getting all the information, and then you might have kind of a naughty or a challenging behavior. Our kids have higher frequency of behaviors because of their higher rates of exhaustion. So I'm working this hard on fine motor skills, on understanding what people are saying, on processing information, on understanding what people are meaning. Excuse me. All of those things add up to, depleting your internal resources a little more quickly, which is why we also see behaviors. We're more likely to engage in distraction strategies when tasks are too difficult or unmotivating, which we kind of connected earlier. And so that's certainly, attributes for a lot of behaviors that kids have. It's almost like kind of saying like, things you're asking me to do are really hard and I'm not really motivated to do it. So I'm going to do all these behaviors to kind of distract from actually getting those things done. Our kids are also less motivated to show what they know. They're already working really hard, and sometimes, it's not really motivating to show somebody that you can count to 10 just for the heck of it, versus if I use something like a first then directive and say, first tell me what, first count to 5 and then you can have your snack or whatever it is. Our kids are highly, highly rewarded by social attention compared to everything else. So one of the challenges is if I'm so motivated by social attention, I might not appreciate that I don't want to get attention for inappropriate behaviors. I want to get attention for appropriate behaviors. And what ends up happening is that our kids know that 100% of the time, if you do something inappropriate, everyone's going to look and pay attention. If I do something good, like maybe I sign help or I, sign play to get another child to play with me, maybe they don't understand what I'm communicating, or maybe they didn't see what I was communicating. Well, a behavior works a lot more effectively to get somebody's attention. And so our kids really learn and stop making a distinction between getting attention for a good behavior versus an inappropriate behavior. So challenging behaviors, if you really think about it, they're communication. It's a communication of a mismatch between, what the child is wanting or needing in that situation and something in their environment. And I do think this is really important because as I read through the list of things that people, brought up, refusing to participate, trouble expressing feelings, flopping to the ground, that all of these things really are connected to communicating something that's not fitting for them. And then our job is to kind of put on our investigator hat and figure out what that is so that we can come up with a good solution. So you might be saying like, yeah, so what? Great, you just told me all this amazing information, but how is that going to ever apply to my specific situation or my specific problem? And again, the reason why I go over all of that is because I want to help people to understand that behaviors are not occurring just because kids want to be stinky, or kids, just want to get attention for naughty behaviors. They happen within the context of an environment that is much more challenging for all the reasons that I just said. And so our kids do have a higher rate of having those behaviors than a typical child would, because things are really hard. So I just, kind of summarize, behaviors occur within the context of a situation, but also occur within the context of neurodevelopment and chronic issues. Like I mentioned, medical issues, medication changes, mental health, all of those things. Understanding that better prepares us to find a more meaningful solution. Super duper important. If you guys ever, if anybody's ever, played darts, and you try to just like blindly throw darts, it's probably not super effective. Versus if you practice and then you kind of identify, kind of the perfect angle to throw that dart. I know that sounds like a weird analogy, but a lot of times I think that when people see a behavior happening, we kind of throw everything at it, including the kitchen sink. And then we get really frustrated because we're like, well, that didn't help. That didn't change anything. And what I would say to you is because we probably didn't have the right solution, right? We didn't have the right reason for the behavior. And if we understand the reason behind the behavior, we're going to come up with a lot more of a bullseye targeted approach that is going to resolve the issue. So behaviors occur for a couple of different reasons. Besides all of those big things that I said already that, kind of are the umbrella, there are also very specific reasons why behaviors happen. So, some of the things that you guys mentioned was, that with regard to behaviors are like impulsive hitting, throwing, waiting, resistance to change, safety. And if you think about those things, we can kind of look at those and go, oh, impulsive hitting. They're just doing that to annoy me, right? But there are a whole multitude of other reasons why hitting might happen. One is that it might be an effective way to get someone's attention. Another reason might be that if I hit, then people move away from me and then I don't have to do the thing they're asking me to do. It might be that I hit because I have a really hard time regulating my emotions and I don't have another way to communicate that. So communication can be another reason. And so when we think about all the reasons why any of these behaviors could happen, it really, illustrates how complex behaviors are. And so say, regarding impulsive hitting, say I don't think about all of those reasons for the behavior and I just come up with one and I say, oh, they're hitting because they're being naughty. If I put them in timeout, then they'll stop hitting. The reality is if they're having a communication problem and we don't address the communication problem, the hitting is just going to keep continuing. And so the idea is that if we understand the function of the behavior or the reason behind the behavior, then we can come up with proactive strategies to implement to stop that behavior from happening. So common functions to behavior, and you don't have to memorize any of these. I'm actually happy to send this PowerPoint to Lauren as well to distribute if that would be helpful. But it's important to understand that, there are some common reasons why behaviors happen. One is social attention. So a person might do a certain behavior to get someone to respond to them or react to them in a specific way. It might be that they're doing it to get someone to look at them, to laugh at them, to play with them, to hug them, or to scold them, which I know sounds weird to say to scold them, but I think that that's, still important to take into consideration. So, sorry, I'm trying to just look at the chat as well. And so, think about this, like if a child runs from an adult, super common behavior that I see in kids with Down syndrome, we have to think about why does that behavior happen? And sometimes, I ask specific questions to describe how it happens, and parents will say, oh, they run from me and they turn and they look at me and they laugh. So the function of that behavior might be social attention or getting attention. Now, if we chase after them and we make a big animated, behavior to try and get to them, what we're effectively doing is saying, yep, keep doing that behavior and we're going to keep reinforcing you for it. We're going to give you what you're asking for, even though the behavior is an inappropriate way to get attention. Now, by no means am I saying that, you shouldn't go and get your child if they run from you, but, we might be able to minimize how much attention we're giving for that behavior by like getting to them really quickly, not changing our facial expression, not looking at them directly, and then bringing them back to where they're supposed to be, and then giving them lots and lots of attention. So they feel like they're getting attention for the appropriate behavior of staying with an adult, and they're not getting attention for running away. Another function is getting something tangible or getting an activity. So some behaviors occur because somebody wants to have access to something they really like, right? I think of the old example of I go to the store, I throw a fit, I drop myself on the floor because I want a toy, and then because my parents are really embarrassed and they don't want everybody to be staring at them, then they buy me the toy. So the next time, what's going to happen? I'm going to throw a temper tantrum for a toy, and I know that that's going to get reinforced. So I think that that's an important thing to kind of take into consideration, because that shapes then how we respond in a situation. Going back to the social attention one real fast, a key way to know if a child is doing something for attention is if they look at you while they're doing the behavior. I know that sounds really silly and simple, but really that's one of the biggest questions I ask is, did they look at you while they were doing the behavior? Escape or avoidance. So trying to get out of doing something. An example that I use, and this is actually ones that have occurred. The examples that I use are based on, the care that I've provided. And I've been at the C Center for 8 years, and this is my full-time job. So I only work with kids with Down syndrome. And I've probably worked with, I would say probably close to 800 kids with Down syndrome at this point. And that doesn't mean how many appointments I've had. That's literally just how many kids with Down syndrome I've worked with. And so, the examples, I'm fortunate enough to have a lot of examples that I can share based on my experience. So escape avoidance. We have a kiddo who's in school, they're sitting at the reading table, and they, don't like reading, and so they start doing something naughty, and the teacher says, go to the principal's office, and the child goes to the principal's office. Now, you can probably already hear where I'm going with this, but the idea is that if you keep doing that, the child's not going to change their behaviors because it's actually helping them out. It's helping them to get out of something that's really hard. And so we have to kind of revise how we're thinking about it. And in this case, the solution kind of that we came up with was that we gave the child a very clear way to interact and to participate, and that actually reduced the challenging behavior in that situation. Some of our kids are actually sensory seekers, or they like the sensory stimulation. You may or may not have heard a lot of people using like sensory integration disorder or sensory issues. You may have heard those terms within the context of other populations, with neurodevelopmental differences like kids with autism. But actually, kids with Down syndrome have a high frequency of sensory needs as well. So, the behavior might not have it might seem like it doesn't have a clear function, but the function is actually, I like the way something feels. I have a lot of people who come to me and they say, I think my child might have autism. And then when I ask them why, they'll say, because they tend to dangle things, or they tap their chin, or they do something repetitive. And what I will say is we have to kind of take that as one point in the bigger picture of what their profile looks like. And particularly because stimming behaviors, or that repetitive sensory input, is not something that's unique to kids with autism. It's actually something that happens at a high frequency in kids with Down syndrome. All right, so with all of that information, if you came to a session or an appointment with me, the thing that I really want to do is I want to teach you how to evaluate behaviors rather than me simply telling you what to do. And the reason I think that's really important is because, one, not everyone has access to a center like the C Center where they have a full-time psychologist that can help with that. And two, man, you guys are going to be with your kids way more than I'm going to be with your kids. And if I can teach you how to understand why a behavior happens, you're going to be so much better equipped to be able to find a solution that works for you and for your family and for your child. So typically what I do is, this is just a little figure that I made. And the reason why I kind of liked this visual is because the observed behavior is kind of like the branches of a tree, right? Or the leaves on the tree. It's what we see. But really, we need to understand what the root or the underlying reason is for that behavior, okay? And so what I typically have families do is I'll give them a copy of this, and I can also send a copy of this to Lauren as well to distribute. But what we do is we write down what's the observed behavior. So in this top box, we're gonna write in like, you know, my child flopped to the ground when I told them it was time to leave the swimming pool, right? So you put that in that box. Then in these yellow boxes, I want you to generate as many ideas as possible about why that behavior happened. And so rather than, you know, going, well, they're just stubborn and they just didn't want to leave, what we want to do is we want to come up with a couple of different ideas. So idea one might be they didn't understand how long they had before we had to leave, so it felt very abrupt. Lots of families bring up transitions, and I can talk a little bit more about that if folks are interested, because I think there's a lot of reasons why transitions are difficult. So in the first box we might write, didn't communicate how long they had beforehand. Second box might be they were doing something fun and they didn't want to leave. Third one might be they have some sensory issues and coming out of the pool was really startling for their system. So you'll see how you can kind of come up with lots of different ideas. Then what you're going to do is, based on each of the ideas or hypotheses you come up with, you're going to write in the green boxes some ideas of what you would do. So for this one, for example, if you say, my child has sensory issues and getting out of the pool was really difficult, your solution might be, before I ask them to get out of the pool, I'm going to make sure I have a towel, some dry clothes, whatever I need to make the sensory experience a little less jarring. Okay? So I'm going to give you an example of one on the next slide. So I actually talked to you guys about this, but let's just kind of flesh it out into a little bit more detail. So the observed behavior is that a child runs from an adult and looks back and laughs, okay? And I want to point out that very young children who don't have Down syndrome run from adults. It's not unique to Down syndrome. But like I told you before, because of the developmental delay, our kids are experiencing that developmental phase at an older age when their bodies are bigger and more capable of running faster and farther, and that their bodies are heavier. So if they flop to the ground, it's harder to pick them up, right? But I've seen plenty, including my own children, who, when they first discovered the excitement of what their legs could do, they might decide, I'm going to run from an adult. But again, my children were small enough that I could come scoop them up and tell them, you're going to have to ride in a stroller. I'm going to carry you if you can't walk. And that repetition then results in something different. So running from an adult and looking back and laughing. So here in the yellow boxes, you can see I wrote out some of the potential functions of the behavior. One might be, I like to get the attention. And like I told you, a hint was that they, in my observed behaviors, that they were looking back and laughing. So one is attention. Another one, might be that they see something that's interesting to them and they don't understand safety, or that they could get hurt. And so they're just running towards something of interest. Another reason might be that they like the sensation of running. Maybe they've been in class all day and they had to sit and listen. And so running is like super exciting and joyful for them. Another reason for running might be that I want to escape a demand. So somebody asked me to do something, running away is an effective way of avoiding having to do it. And then the last one might be a skill deficit. So skill deficits are actually quite common in kids with Down syndrome. And the reason I say that is because there's a lot of things that we kind of assume people should know, or that they should just intuitively know. And the reality is that kids with Down syndrome are great with learning skills like that, but it might just be that it's not intuitive, right? So say, for example, I, wanted to get my parents' attention. A skill deficit might be that I don't know how to get their attention in a socially appropriate way. And so I do it inappropriately. And then that gets reinforced. And so then it happens more and more and more. And so the proactive strategy, when we're talking about teaching the skill, is how do I practice proactively how to get somebody's attention without running from them? So as you can see, like we can come up with lots of different ideas, and then underneath each of them, we're going to come up with a solution. So if a person runs from an adult and laughs because they want attention, here in the green boxes, we're going to write what are the proactive strategies you can implement and what are the reactive strategies you can implement. A proactive strategy might be then when I'm walking with a child with Down syndrome from point A to point B, I'm going to give them lots and lots of attention proactively so they don't feel like they have to run in order to get my attention. It's going to sound like totally crazy and silly, but when I practice it in the hospital, we're literally like having parents hold their child's hand, and the whole time that they're walking, they're pointing things out to their kids, and they're saying things like, oh, you're doing such a good job listening. I love when you hold my hand. Oh, what are you doing? Or are you having a good day? But essentially you're keeping them engaged in a conversation, because if you're doing that, then I don't feel like I have to run in order to get your attention because I already have it. So that would be a proactive strategy. A reactive strategy would be what I said before, which is if the child runs, you move to them as quickly as possible. You don't change your facial expression. You don't say anything to them, and you don't look directly at them, so that you're not giving them what they want, which is, kind of high level of your attention. Running in particular, you still want to actually, want to still get to them to keep them safe, but you don't want to give them more attention than you have to in that situation. So that's the reactive strategy. If a child sees something of interest, a great strategy. This was one of my favorite things that we worked on in the hospital, walking around the hospital. We had a kiddo who had the same behavior. The reason for their behavior turned out to be they saw something of interest, and they would try to run to it to go check it out. And because this kiddo didn't understand that you could get hit by a car, or you might run into somebody, or any of those things, didn't appreciate that challenge or that safety issue, they would just run towards it. And so what we practiced was holding hands and having this kiddo point to what they were interested in looking at. And so the beautiful thing was, and this kiddo just made me look like a really awesome psychologist because it worked so well, is we would walk a couple of steps, and then when I noticed that the child was looking at something, I would model how to point to it and say, let's go, right? And so this kiddo would point to it and look at mom and say, let's go. And then mom would reinforce that behavior by then going to what that was. So we practiced in a safe environment at first to kind of get him really used to pointing, and then, essentially being able to say, let's go, or I want to look at that, but in a more socially appropriate way. And when possible, then mom could reinforce it and take him to be able to look at that. Liking the sensation of running would have a solution basically of, related to, can we get that child that input around running at various intervals of time throughout the day, so that they don't feel like they need to do it in an inappropriate situation. We also use visual cues to show when it's okay to run and when it's not. So, green means go, stop sign, or green means go, a sign that we show when we're on a playground. Red means stop, meaning this is not a situation that's appropriate to run in. Escaping a demand. So we want to see, like, what's difficult about the demand. Is it because, the work is too hard? Is it because they don't understand what they're supposed to do? So the proactive thing is that we come up with what is making it difficult, and then we try to make it a little bit more manageable for the child. Now, one thing I will say is that sometimes parents will say, but it's too hard to think about all of this right in the moment. And what I'll say is, it's highly unlikely that a behavior is only going to happen once. And so if you haven't had enough practice with identifying these things really quickly, and then, kind of responding in a specific way, that's okay. Sit down afterwards and write out this, this chart, and really then come up with what's the most likely reason why a behavior is happening. And so, then you can, the next time, be ready for that situation again. Skill deficit, I already kind of talked about. So once you kind of identified the hypotheses or the reasons you think the behavior might be happening, you kind of pick for your specific child what you think is the most likely reason. So if I say, oh, it's because my kiddo sees something of interest and they don't know to tell me that they want to go look at it. And so if that's the reason, then you look in this box and you implement these strategies in order to change the behavior. Okay. And if that doesn't work, the beautiful thing is it's not because you did anything wrong. It might be because you just didn't have the right function of the behavior or the right reason behind the behavior. So you come back to the same sheet and go, oh, what's the next most likely reason? Oh, it's a skill deficit. All right, what's in our box underneath that to kind of address the same thing? Okay, I'm doing a lot of talking, and I want to actually hear if somebody's willing to be brave and share a specific behavior that you're concerned about. And if no one responds, then you can unmute yourself and share. But if you don't feel comfortable, I have the list of behaviors that families had mentioned as well that I can use.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. So you already just touched on the one that we struggle with a lot, which is our daughter running away. And like you said, she just looks at us and laughs. And I think a lot of the time she does it for attention. But I'm trying to think of a different one that she does. So lately she has been, I'll just go with like the red box that you have up there. So
Beautiful.
lately she has been like getting frustrated and angry and hurting herself in some way. Like she will pull her hair, or she'll scratch her face, or like slam on her ears really hard. And it's something we've been trying to figure out, like how to address with her, I guess.
How old did you say she was?
She's 4.5.
Okay.
And she's completely nonverbal.
Okay.
So I think that has something to do with it. But so for instance, the other day we have this miniature bounce house and we were playing on it, and she was trying to climb up the slide. And it's a slippery material, so she kept sliding back down. And so she got frustrated with herself because she couldn't get all the way to the top of the slide. So she like yelled, and then she started pulling out her hair.
Oh, poor baby. And then how did you guys respond?
I kind of just told her not to do that.
Okay.
I don't know how to respond to it. So she did it multiple times for different reasons. Like another time on the same time of day, playing on the bounce house, she hit her sister, and I made her take a break. I said, Addie, we use gentle hands, and I made her sit next to me for a few minutes, and she started scratching her face. And I don't hug her. Maybe I should. I just tell her, Addie, don't do that. Use gentle hands. And she usually follows it up with a meltdown of sadness, kind of like she'll just start crying and be sad for a little bit, and then she goes back to normal. But I think I can tell that she also is, I don't know if she fully does it for attention, but I can tell she sometimes looks back at me to see like if I'm watching, or I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's such a beautiful example and perfect for the age that you're describing as well. So you did such a nice job of explaining the observed behavior. And let's talk about the first one of climbing up the slide. It's slippery. I can't get up there, and I'm going to pull my hair or scratch my face or do something aggressive towards myself. So, a lot of people had talked about like kids getting frustrated. And so when we talk about this observed behavior and we think about what are the possible reasons behind the behavior, what I would say is one box certainly could have communication, right? I'm frustrated. I, don't know how to ask for help. Or I'm, it's kind of either, when you mentioned that she's nonverbal, so either not having a way of saying that you need help, or if I signed help and nobody saw it, then it still kind of creates the same problem, right? So certainly that can be a part of it. So in box number 1, we would put communication. In box number 2, we might say self-regulation, or not being able to communicate a frustration in a way other than a behavior. And unfortunately, when we think about fight or flight, which, is kind of the body's natural biological process for processing high emotions, our instinct is actually to fight or flee, right? It's fight, flight, freeze. But you do one of those things. And so if we kind of in box number 2 said emotion regulation, or, kind of fight or flight, then that behavior is kind of like impulsive response of what I do when I'm frustrated. You mentioned another possible reason for the behavior might be getting attention. And so, I do it and I look back, and then does somebody come and help me or come and rescue me? And so then that solution feels appropriate, even though it's inappropriate to getting that help or whatever it is that's needed, or getting attention. And most of the time, I would say that if a child harms themselves, and it's because of like needing help and not being able to communicate it, what I notice is that, for parents in general, the natural instinct is to help if your child is upset. But the problem
Right.
is that in Behavior 101 is that if you help right after a child injures themselves, the child learns that injuring themselves gets them help, if that makes sense. And
Right. Yeah.
so you have to create a little bit of a pause between those two things. And so, that could be another box that we put that in. So what I would tell you is that in that situation, if you kind of had to decide, what you feel like the highest likelihood reason is for that behavior, what would you think it would be?
I want to say the second yellow box. I think the emotion regulation.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I think it's a mixture kind of communication and then the regulation thing.
Yeah. And so,
Just because she can't tell us, I know she's angry, but she can't tell us, so she's trying to show us, how she knows
right.
how to communicate with us.
Yes, absolutely. And so you bring up an important point, which is you can have more than one function to a behavior. It can be, actually, we usually talk about a primary function and a secondary function. And so sometimes, those can kind of loop in as well, just like you're describing. And so in
Right.
that situation, what I would say the solution would be is, remember, we always do proactive and reactive. Proactive meaning what's the skill or what's the thing I need to help teach her, right? And that might be, how do I help her communicate emotions? And we could kind of go off on a really long tangent about how to do that, and I'm happy to offer more details related to it. But one of the first things that I start off with for kids even that young is, how often do we label our own emotions? Like, stubbing your toe almost on purpose and then being like, ouch, I'm mad, and then using the level of language. Can't see me doing this, but I'm doing the sign for mad. But being able to kind of increase a person's ability to communicate their emotions that way versus that impulsive way of that's inappropriate. So you almost have to practice it outside of those contexts when the emotions are super heightened. And the reason is because it's almost like if we create enough muscle memory for using a sign or using the alternative to say that they're upset, then you're going to see a decrease in the reactive muscle memory that she has now, which is to impulsively touch her face, pull her hair, things like that. So it takes a while to kind of build up for that. But that would be like one proactive solution, is always modeling that. And then even practicing, like I've even used like baby dolls. So like, saying like even the situation. So kind of like making the doll go up the slide and then keep falling down. So almost like imitating what happened for your daughter, and then being able to, again, communicate what the emotion was, or even being able to sign help, right? Or to communicate help in whatever way is reasonable. And then you practice that, and then again, it becomes the new muscle memory versus the instinctual muscle memory, which is harming oneself. The reactive solution that I would say is really important, because there is an attention-seeking piece to this as well, which is, again, natural, right? Like if I'm also hurting myself, I might naturally just look at an adult when I do that. But what I would tell you is that right when she's doing the injury, as long as she's in a safe space and she's not like repetitively doing it, I would say, what can you do to make the situation safe, but minimizing how much attention you're giving? So if she's somebody who repeatedly pulls her hair, I would, maybe push her hands down without saying or doing anything. but I wouldn't give her a hug or anything because that might be reinforcing. Just pushing hands down or blocking. And if she's, a kiddo who pulls hair once and then stops, then, you're going to miss it anyway. And so you basically just wait for a few seconds until she looks calm. And it doesn't mean that she's like completely not upset, but really I say it's like a moment of calm when she takes a deep breath or she stops crying for a moment. And then when she does that, then you look at her and you say, oh, you needed help. And you sign help, or you, again, model for her what the communication is that you are trying to say, or I'm mad. And when you do that, then again, we want to proactively load on the front end, because the more a behavior happens, the more likely it's going to keep happening because you're creating that muscle memory. So the reactive solution you have to have, because you're not always going to be able to predict when she gets upset, but the proactive part should be the heavy hitter. And then the reactive is kind of what I just described. Does that make sense?
Yes, perfect sense. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned
Thank
that
you.
yeah, no problem. No problem. Does anybody else feel like sharing? Hold on, I think there was one in the chat. My daughter's 19. She self-talks. It is usually with us at home. It is often pretend play. She has self-talked for a long time. I wanted some insight into why. I wanted to gain some insight into why she does this. Also, a way to minimize it without hurting her feelings. Oh, such a beautiful explanation. And so what I would tell you is this is a great example that goes back to that neurodevelopmental difference piece. Self-talk is not uncommon in individuals with Down syndrome, and it's actually not uncommon in the general population. It's just that the difference between people who know how to have your inside voice, your internal voice, and your external voice. And so in this observed behavior, we might say, that this person self-talks, and pretend plays a lot, right? And then we say, why is that? What are our hypothesized reasons? And so I'm going to give you a couple of different ones that are very common and things that I've come across. So reason number one is the world is basically in fast forward and my brain is processing at a normal speed, right? And so if that happens, because of those neurodevelopmental differences and slower processing speed, you essentially have, someone who's going throughout their day and they're observing behaviors, they're trying to, comprehend verbal information, which is hard for them, and they're missing a lot of key pieces of information that occur throughout the day. And so they might be going through their day and, not necessarily getting everything that they need. And so that self-talk frequently is kind of a replay of what happened during the day. And, you mentioned that your daughter is self-talking or pretend playing. So we'll talk about that. That's different from I'm saying things that I heard during the day. But a lot of times that narration can be like, Joey, turn in your homework. Or they might be saying things that they heard people say. But now all of a sudden when I'm self-talking, I can process that information at my pace versus the pace that it was presented to me out in the community. And so it's absolutely a positive way of kind of processing information. When you think about it from the standpoint of self-talk in play, it can also be, so I'm just saying she is also repeating as well. So if it's self-talk in the context of pretend play, think about from a communication standpoint, especially at your daughter's age, that it is really hard to maintain a conversation. I have a high level, so box number 2 might be, I have a high level of motivation to interact with others, but my skill set for managing a conversation or for having a relationship or for having a topic that other people can relate to is not the same as for a typical person. And so sometimes we see pretend play because guess what? When you're pretend playing, you don't have to explain yourself to anybody. You don't have to tell people what you mean by something. You get to dictate what's going to happen, and so it becomes a lot easier when you're able to control the narrative, when you can control the situation. For the repetitiveness, it can be a number of different reasons, and obviously, without meeting each of your loved ones with Down syndrome, I'm giving you kind of these generic responses because based on kind of my knowledge base for these behaviors, but it could be something that you have to explore from a mental health standpoint. is the person depressed? Are they, repetitively talking about things that are very sad, or things that have been hard to process emotionally? Some of our kids repeat themselves, where again, we could do a whole nother tree for that, right? So the observed behavior is repetitive talk. And here are some of the reasons why that happens. One reason is I really, really want to engage socially, but I have a limited number of communication strategies to do that. And so I repeat myself because I still then feel like I'm having a conversation because people keep answering me, but I don't have to come up with a new topic. Another reason might be I'm anxious, and it's reassuring to me when I keep asking the same thing over and over again, or keep saying the same thing over and over again, because then somebody responds to me and gives me that reassurance. Now, if you know anything about anxiety disorders, it never is enough, right? So think about people who are afraid that, like, they left their garage door open. No amount of checking the garage door is actually going to make that feeling go away. And so they might be checking like 30 times. It was closed the first time, but the 30th time is when I feel better. When we think about self-talk, it's kind of the same thing. If somebody asks a question and somebody keeps answering, that might cause the behavior to actually occur even more often, because there's a chance that my anxiety level is going to go down the next time, the next time that I actually get an answer. I'm seeing she is also repeating as well. She loves microphones and pretends to be an MC for shows. Should we discourage her love of microphones? No. I mean, I think that's great. What I would say is that you can also limit when it happens. So rather than it being like something that's all consuming, for our young adults, one of the things I worry about is kids enjoying talking to themselves or being by themselves and doing their preferred activities so much that they stop kind of doing other things like interacting with other people. And if you start noticing that, then you have to start creating kind of rules around it. So it might be that, you have the microphones in a container, lockbox or locked closet, and you tell your daughter, we're going to do this, this, and this. Then once you're done with those 3 things, then you can have microphone time. And then you might use a visual timer, and I'll show you some of these things, these tools later in the presentation. I just kind of threw them on there and as a way of kind of wrapping up. But what you would do is you put it in there, and then essentially you would say, hey, you're going to do these 3 things, and then you can have microphone time. And then you're going to use a visual timer to show her how long she can have microphone time before she has to go and do 3 other things before she has more microphone time. But if you're doing it that way, then it's something that you can use as a motivator. It's completely fine to use, but you are the one who gets to dictate how much of it she gets, and you're able to control that not becoming all consuming. Okay? Thank you. I love the exclamation marks. It makes me feel really good. Does anybody else want to share a problem that we can kind of show as playing out on this? And I hope you guys know that, I appreciate the fact that in 90 minutes, I can't give you every single tool for how to address these behaviors. But my hope is just to get you guys started with appreciating that behaviors can happen for a lot of different reasons, and that our proactive and reactive strategies we come up with really, really have to be based on the reason behind the behavior in order for the behavior to change. If it's not, and we miss the boat, then you're going to end up feeling pretty frustrated because the problem is not going to go away. And that's why I think this is so critical.
So I have an example, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I have a 4.5-year-old son with Down syndrome.
Uh-huh.
This has been happening for a while. He will, like, his sister will be having TV time, and he'll go up to her and like start pulling her hair and like grabbing her. I'm assuming that he's doing it because he wants her to play with him, because recently he's started to like laugh when he does it.
Okay.
And so, she gets upset because he's pulling her hair, and I'm sure she's probably just reinforcing it by, getting upset and saying, Leo, don't.
Yep.
So I think I understand that correctly. Recently, he's been starting to do it to me too, which he never used to, but we just had another baby. So I'm sure it's probably because he's feeling like I'm spending a lot of time with the baby when usually it's with him.
Yeah.
So my question is, what can she do, or what can we do? What can we do after that? So I think I understand the behavior and why he's doing it, but not necessarily what to do about it.
Beautiful. So you kind of already, I love that you already kind of came up with the primary reason behind the behavior, which it sounds like is attention in both of those situations. I want your attention. I don't want you to give it elsewhere. And so this one's a fun one because the proactive, I understand that you can't always control like how siblings respond, but the most powerful tool is to give them a specific thing to do in order to prevent them from doing the inappropriate thing in reaction to it. So what I would say from the proactive standpoint that I would do is I would do a couple things. So one is if I would practice using a visual timer, and I'll show you what that looks like later on. Practice using a visual timer to show how long Leo has to wait before he can have your attention, okay? So the proactive strategy, that's one proactive strategy, is practicing how long I have to wait before I get your attention, okay? The other proactive strategy is showing how to do like this tap, right? So tapping on the shoulder to gain attention. So what I would tell you to do, since he's 4.5, you can actually turn this into a game. And his sister would be a beautiful way of practicing. So she would basically sit on the floor with her back to him, and basically you would then coach him on tapping her on the shoulder, or I'm not sure if he's verbal or not, but if he can say play, then he would tap and say play. And then
so he's nonverbal.
Okay.
And
so
he also does that sometimes. Like he'll tap. For me, he'll come up to me and tap me on the arm to get my attention. And that's when I turn to him. I guess he probably doesn't do it to her because she doesn't respond to it.
And our kids do have a hard time generalizing, like so using the same strategy in a couple different situations. So when I'm describing this game that you're going to play, she's going to sit with her back to him and you're going to be there to coach this, right? So you're going to show him to tap on the shoulder. And then when he taps, she's going to turn around in a really animated way and either tickle him or go, hey, buddy, and give him a high five, or do something that's like really reinforcing and rewarding, right? And then you're going to practice that. And then she's going to turn around. Again, he's going to tap, turn around. Like you're going to practice that back and forth. Then if you notice that he's doing inappropriate things like pulling her hair, you already have practiced with her that she can model on herself to tap. So you're basically going to take, I wonder if I can, sorry, I'm just trying to see if I can start my video. So you basically are going to take your own finger. She's going to take her own finger and she's going to tap her own hand. So obviously he's pulling her hair. So she's, we're going to try to minimize the screaming about it, but she's going to quickly just tap her own shoulder. The second he touches her shoulder, she's going to turn around and go, oh, did you want to play? Right?
Okay, so she's going to show him how to do it.
Yes, she's going to model it. And by doing that, what she's essentially doing is she's showing him that when he pulls her hair, she's not giving him attention. When he taps her shoulder, she's giving him lots of attention. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
the visual timer thing is helping him to wait. So if she's watching TV and he wants to play, him understanding how long he has to wait. Kids with Down syndrome have a really hard time with abstract concepts like the concept of time. So when you're saying wait just 1 minute, he's just going to keep doing what he's doing because 1 minute has no meaning to him. But when we show him on a visual timer, which I can show you in a little bit, how long 1 minute is, the second that timer goes off, he turns and gives, she gives him the animated response. And then he learns, the visual timer told me how long I had to wait. I can totally wait for that amount of time. I just can't wait for an amount of time that I don't know exists. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I kind of muddied a little bit and told you the reactive strategy as well as the proactive strategy, but hopefully that helps.
So there's one other thing that I have a question about.
Yeah.
He's funny because it's almost as if he's doing it on his own terms, because a lot of time, she'll go up to him and play with him and he'll be like, oh, I'm playing with my toy, and he'll turn away from her and go and do his own thing. But then it's like when he is, seeking the attention, that's when he will go and do that to her.
But you know what? He's like beautifully at that developmental age where he's basically like the world revolves around me and my schedule. And so the challenge is that in his mind, he's not doing anything wrong. In his mind, he's basically like, well, you need to do things when I want you to do. But if I'm busy, then why are you bothering me? And so that will naturally get better. When we look at kind of the research on behaviors in Down syndrome, especially what we call externalized behaviors, hitting, throwing, flopping, anything like that, versus internalized, which might be self-talk or being tearful or things like that. If you had zero intervention, those behaviors in kids with Down syndrome would decrease, those externalized behaviors. And that's an important thing to note. But the reason that's true is because our kids' brains are still developing that impulse control. They're still developing all those things. It's just going to take longer, for that to develop enough where, it doesn't stay this kind of gigantic problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. I'm just looking at the chat. This is, if there's time, a big issue we have is throwing food when eating, throws it on the floor, throws it across the table, or throws it at us. Well, mom. Tonight was throwing turkey on the floor, piece of broccoli thrown at me at my plate, and piece of broccoli thrown at my face. Okay, so if we look at this, observed behavior, you just beautifully described all the observed behaviors. If I were to think about why that behavior is happening, I'd have a lot of different suggestions. And part of the reason for that also is because I do feeding co-treats. Behaviors come up a lot in kids who have feeding issues. And so sometimes it's hard to distinguish if it's a feeding challenge because a child has oral motor issues with the food, or if it's a feeding issue because the child doesn't like the texture of the food, or is it a feeding behavior because it's kind of like throwing is just easier to do to get rid of it. So when I think about these things from an observed behavior perspective, one reason I might say is, does the child have the oral motor skills for the food that I'm presenting? So a lot of our kids have a really hard time with chewing and with using their tongue, which is thicker than a typical child, moving food from one side to the other. And so a great way to get rid of food that you can't manage is by throwing or getting rid of it. Another reason might be to get attention. Every time I throw something, people get upset. I love looking at their animated facial expressions, so I throw it for that reason. Another reason might be I'm done eating, and throwing is a more efficient or easier way to do it than to put it down on the tray or to say or sign all done or any of those types of things. So you can see that there could be a lot of different reasons why that behavior is happening. Throwing is also a developmental behavior. So again, what I would say is really small children, typical children, throw, especially when they're in high chairs, and we don't give it a second thought because one, the phase is shorter and we get over it faster, and they're smaller and so they can't throw as far or make as big of a stink about it. Whereas like kids with Down syndrome stay in that developmental phase for a longer period of time because of the length of time it takes to develop new skills. And they're doing it when they're older, which means they can throw and do all those things at a much, more forceful manner than they'd be able to otherwise. Without knowing kind of what the reason for this behavior is, I'm gonna just offer some suggestions. So if the child is throwing because they don't have the oral motor skills to manage that food, I would really say, thinking about what are all the foods that they throw? Is it always something that's hard and crunchy, or is it always something that, kind of just has a weird texture? And I would say working with a feeding therapist or working with an OT that specializes in feeding, or a speech therapist that specializes in feeding, be able to help kind of evaluate what foods are safe and what foods are manageable, because we would see a decrease in throwing behaviors as a result. If the throwing is to get attention, what I would tell you is that you don't want to give attention. So if sometimes people will say they throw, and I pick it up and I put it back and I say, we don't throw. Well, effectively what we've done is we've caused that behavior to keep happening or happen at a higher rate. Because now all of a sudden this child is like, haha, when I throw it, I get all this attention. And so what I would say is in that situation, if they're throwing for attention, I would, let them throw. Don't, which I know is horrible for like OCD people like me who have a really hard time with the things that are dirty. But you essentially would, not give attention when they're throwing. And then when they pause in their behavior, and you can kind of count to 3 slowly or to 5 slowly, and they haven't had the behavior, then you're going to look at them and give them lots of attention. And you're going to be like, you're doing such a good job eating your dinner, or are you done eating? Or you're going to say whatever it is, right? If the child throws because they're all done, what we're going to do is we're actually going to sit next to them. So the proactive strategy versus the reactive. The reactive strategy is when they throw, we don't want to give it attention, right? We're going to wait, and then we're going to do the proactive strategy, but after the fact. So the proactive strategy is you're going to sit right next to them, and each time when they're eating, if they look like they're about to throw, you're going to redirect their hand to a bowl that's going to be sitting on the table or sitting next to them. That's the all done bowl. And I would suggest, you could use like an easy peasy bowl that like kind of suctions to the tray so that there's less of a chance of being able to quickly pick it up and throw. And you basically are going to redirect their hand to the all done bowl, or have them sign all done. You're going to proactively, while you're sitting, you're going to remind them, remember, when you're all done, you can say all done in whatever way that child communicates. By doing that, what you're essentially doing is you're retraining their brain to say all done when they're done versus throwing to indicate that they're done eating. It's so important because muscle memory is like the fastest way to get rid of something is to chuck it, right? It's not socially appropriate, but it's effective. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to find a balance between helping kids to understand what the socially appropriate way to say I'm all done is, and creating that muscle memory for the new version that we're going to ask them to do instead of the old version that we're asking them to do. I can't remember what the other potential reasons were. We said attention, I'm all done, sensory issues, oral motor issues. Yeah, so I think we covered all of the different reasons. If I didn't cover a reason that you think might be the reason, please feel free to either unmute yourself and share, or share in the chat box too. Okay, so I'm looking at another one that says, sorry, it's a little hard to scroll. Our daughter will trip or bump into a piece of furniture. She will get super mad and lash out at the nearest person, her sister, the dog, or when we are in school up here. Oh goodness. So again, not a behavior that I haven't seen. And what I would say, depending on the age of your child, typically, if they're really, really young, you kind of have to modify your curriculum for teaching emotion regulation, depending on the age. There's curriculum for teenagers, and I'm assuming, I'm not necessarily fully assuming, but kind of assuming, if your child is like school age or older, a curriculum that I really like is called the Zones of Regulation, because it's really kind of proactively helping kids check in about where their mood is throughout the day. So it's not just saying, oh, you're mad and upset, let's deal with that. Because the reality is that's a great way to target yourself as the source of the frustration and get hit. So what I would say is that, Zones of Regulation would be a great curriculum to think about using. It uses a color system to relate to a specific mood. And I would say even at school, a proactive strategy would be like at the beginning of every period or at the beginning of every subject change, we show the visual and we say, where are you, what color are you? And if it's like blue, which is like slow, feeling slow and sluggish, then we look right underneath it and we say, here are the things that I do when I'm feeling that way. If you're red and you're mad, then underneath that, you visually already have the strategies, so that we're not, relying on a broken working memory or a broken verbal processing system to recall what it is that I'm supposed to do in that moment. So what I would say is that it'd be important to kind of take that into consideration. If the super mad lashing out is something that's chronically happening, the other thing to make sure that you take into consideration is the behavior something that you can address with behavioral strategies like teaching emotion regulation and coping strategies, or is it something that might be mood disorder related and something that you kind of need to have further evaluated? I'm not by any means saying every child needs to be on medication. I don't believe in that. I'm a psychologist and not a psychiatrist for a reason. I really love behavioral strategies and interventions, but I also recognize that there is a difference between a behavior that's happening because there's a function to it, and just developmental with impulse control, and then there's behaviors that happen that are, you know, for bigger reasons, perhaps like a mental health issue. Is there a way to make our children more compliant? I hear a lot of no. I said no when I asked my daughter to do things. It doesn't seem to matter if it is preferred or non-preferred. My daughter is 6 years old. Oh, the impulsive no. It's such a magical thing that I encounter a ton. Some kids will impulsively say no, but then do it. Some kids will say no and they really mean it, and whether it's preferred or non-preferred. And so one thing that I would say is that keeping a routine and keeping things really predictable is super important for helping kids to understand that they won't have access to those preferred activities and we're not going to use them as motivators if they're not able to comply with the non-preferred activities. So, you know, I feel bad because I'm not giving kind of a lengthy enough response with regard to this specific question, because I feel like compliance is a really complicated problem, and I think that it can be, again, for a number of reasons. And so what I would tell you to do is maybe take this sheet and start writing out more detailed observations about when she says no. And it may feel like she says no every single time, and if that's true, then it's true. But if it's not, you might actually find more information in the times that she doesn't say no than the times that she does. The other thing that I would really take into consideration is some of those setting events or those global issues that I mentioned might be part of the issue. So sleep apnea, I feel like, is a huge contributor to mood dysregulation, and kids being kind of grumpy all day and having a much harder time with following expectations, even if it is something motivating. So we kind of have to look at things in a more complex way and say, what are some global issues that might be contributing to irritability? Then what are some immediate things that I might be reinforcing in that moment? So I think that that would be the place that I would start. So going back to the hitting. So the person said, we typically say, ouch, that fall really hurt. You can say, ouch, that hurt, but it's not okay to hit. Do you have any other ideas? So I would actually say that the mood regulation piece is going to be something proactively that would be helpful in addition to what you're already doing. And what I would actually say is that you know, saying ouch, that fall really hurt, you're absolutely trying to model that. But again, her behaviors already happened. And so I would say, just like I said with the, you know, oh, I need help, with you know, our little 4.5-year-old friend who, you know, would self-harm in that moment of frustration, is I would say, can we proactively practice? So again, like, you know, turn it into like a little game. We're going to dramatically fall to the floor and we're going to practice saying, ouch, that really hurt, right? And again, I know it sounds silly, but we're really, really working on creating that muscle memory to do the behavior that we want, instead of having muscle memory after the fact for the behavior that we don't want to happen. Yes, I will send the observed behavior chart, the PowerPoint, the all done goal. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Patel. I'm sorry. So first I want to say thank you, and thank you, Lauren, for doing this. I actually saw you when you came before a while ago, but my daughter was a baby. She's 4.5 now. And one, I like the way you explain it versus respond. I read a lot about respond and not react. And honestly, I didn't really, I knew what it meant, but I was one of the people that were in a practical setting. It's hard to respond and not react sometimes, especially with my daughter who's 4.5 and has some constipation issues and some other things based on a medical diagnosis that she has. And when she touches, she's sleeping, so I was about to spell it out, but she's sleeping, so it doesn't matter. When she touches poop now, that's like a big thing for her. So I kind of wanted to talk about like diaper changes and stuff with 4.5-year-olds. Because she kicks, like they're becoming really, really hard now. And I just didn't know if you had any kind of input on that. And like I said, it's hard to not react, when somebody's like messing with poop or whatever's going. Like the first thing is like screaming and that kind of attention. And I know it's like obviously not her fault or something she can control, but diaper changes are really rough right now.
And so she kicks when you're trying to change her, and then she reaches back and she touches her poop. Is that correct?
Well, she probably touched the poop before, so she probably had dug in her diaper. I've cleaned her up, and now I'm trying to change her, and now we got the kicking. Probably something like that is usually the scenario.
And so again, when we're thinking about why kids like touch their poop, I mean, sometimes it's like the sensation and exploration. Sometimes it's a precursor to toilet training, in that, when I stick my hand down, I like, I'm like, oh, I feel something different, right? And so the two things that I would say is the correct strategy would be restricting access to her diaper. And so always keeping her in, a onesie, or keeping her in biker shorts, things that kind of make it a little bit harder, or a unitard underneath clothing, get harder to dig in. And what I would tell you to do is teaching her to, like, as soon as you smell that she's gone, and even if she can't kind of reach in there yet, what you're going to do is you're going to show her the sign for diaper, or if she has language saying diaper change. So basically, part of the escalation, it sounds like, is because you're stopping her from touching her poop, and she's already upset, and then by the time that you are at the table to change her, then the frustration levels are already even higher. So I hope that makes sense, that you would restrict access to the diaper, teach her a different way to communicate to you that she needs to be changed. And then during changing time, one thing that I would suggest is, can you have something that occupies her that she can have only during changing time? So something that's like a preferred toy, or a preferred book, or something like that, where the only time you give it to her so that it stays motivating is during changing time. So essentially, like, oh, you notice the diaper needs to be changed, you sign or say diaper, and then when she repeats it, then you go, oh, yeah, let's get our special book, or let's get our special toy. You walk over, get the toy. She's engaged, she's distracted, she's also motivated by the toy because we're not letting her have it at all times. And I wonder if that would help reduce some of the inappropriate behaviors that are happening during changing. The other thing that I would suggest is there pain related to being wiped, or anything like that? Because constipation can really result in some, pretty significant, issues that make it much more aversive to be changed. And if that's the case, I'm sure it sounds like you're addressing the constipation proactively, but sometimes the kind of relaxation around being changed can work much more effectively when you're not trying to fight somebody from doing something that's hurting you, even if they're not meaning to.
Yes, definitely. That's a good point. Yeah, there's a lot of based on her other diagnosis, medically, there can be a lot of like diaper rash and stuff sometimes with it. So I know when that happens. Like I don't want to say I absolutely know how to deal with that. At those times, I won't even fight her. I won't, when I know that that's what it is, I don't even like necessarily, I don't want to say fight her, but I'm not even trying to push for the diaper change because I know it's really, really sore.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Like I have these blue pads all around the house and different things, just to like let her lay down and relax and everything, and then but we've been dealing with this for a long time. But so diaper changes can be tough, and like the kicking and stuff, like that's kind of a big deal all of a sudden.
Yeah. And has she shown any interest in wanting to toilet train?
Yeah, so she does. So she does get on the potty. She does have words. But because of her, she's born with what's called an imperforated anus. So there is some trouble with knowing when she has to go.
Yep.
So sometimes it's not until she goes, and then I got to run and put her on the potty. And I use the tablet on the potty. Like that's her thing. Well, she has her tablet anytime, but she knows that she'll get her tablet on the potty. So sometimes she'll even be like, I got to go potty. And I know she just wants her tablet, but I'll just like put her on there. but yeah, so we're working on that, and I'm working with the doctors. But I was trying to address with the kicking part, and it's definitely a struggle. Like she's very, very strong-willed, and
Yeah,
her
yeah,
receptive. She knows everything. She knows it. That's why I said I was going to spell things, because she knows so much. Her receptive is like off the
yeah.
charts.
I mean, I wonder if then if, and I mean, you tell me if this, you feel like this wouldn't work, but I wonder if you could use the iPad as a motivator for changing too. So what you would say is, first we have quiet feet, and then you can have the iPad, right? And so quiet feet meaning like my feet are calm, and then I have the iPad. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
Or even whatever the special toy is, or whatever it is, you could do it that way, so that you're basically kind of scooched a little bit away from her so she can't kick you. And then when you're saying first do the thing you don't want to do, and then you get to do the thing you want to do. So first have quiet feet, and then you can have that.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to take up too much time. People might have other question, but I just.
Oh, I think I lost you.
Oh, sorry.
Oh.
One more thing. I'm sorry. So I've been bribing her a lot, and I don't know if other people do that, if that's typical, if that's normal. So I have been, I don't want to say first then, but I've been like, you can't have that tablet, or you can't do this. Is that normal?
So I think that's a beautiful question, and I want to try and reframe, because I'm sure that that's something that a lot of people have a question about. I want to reframe what you're saying. Rather than calling it bribing, I want you to call it motivating. And the reason why is that there's a difference between the two. Bribing to me is, I do a naughty behavior, and then somebody gives me something good so that I'll stop doing the naughty behavior. To me, that's bribing. That's not going to be an effective tool for your lifetime, because the behaviors are just going to keep getting reinforced. Motivating is really how the world works, right? If I go to work, I get a paycheck. Like, that's cause and effect. And so if I consider it from that perspective, and I say, can I motivate my child to do these things? Then it's motivating them to do the expected behaviors that are hard for them, versus rewarding inappropriate behavior by bribing them with something. So I don't know if that distinction makes sense, but I do think that that's really important. And as I mentioned earlier, there is neurodevelopmental, biological information we have that kids with Down syndrome have a harder time with persisting with a task and remaining motivated. And so, because they may not understand why something's important to us, and they might not be motivated to do it because it's something that feels hard. So my motivation to avoid doing that is higher than my motivation to do it for you. So we do have to sometimes add in motivators that are important to our kids to get them to do those things. So for example, in a morning routine, I might say, wake up, sit on potty, brush teeth, then listen to music, right? To me, I'm motivating that child to get through the things they don't want to do so they can get to the thing they want to do. Whereas if I, if I told them we're going to wake up, go to, sit on the potty, brush teeth, and by the time that they get to brush teeth, they're having a, temper tantrum. And then all of a sudden I go, okay, let's brush your teeth, and then we can listen to music. To me, that's bribing, and that's not going to be an effective strategy for changing the behavior. I see a lot of comments. I'm just going to try and zip through.
So while you're reading those, Dr. Patel, I just wanted to mention, so we are doing another behavior workshop with Stacy Taylor on Thursday, September 24th, similar to this.
Perfect.
And then we're offering one-on-one consults with her team on the 25th and 26th. So we have those slots available, but you guys need to email me to book your time slot, and then you'll be able to do a one-on-one consult with someone from their behavior team. So if you're interested in that, please email me. It will fill up quickly, but that would be able to let you guys address some of the questions one-on-one with someone too, and go into more detail.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I am noticing the time, and so I also want to just say that I will send some of these resources that people have asked for to Lauren. And then Lauren, you're welcome to share my email address for things that people put in the chat box that I wasn't able to get to.
Okay.
I am happy to try and just, respond to those more individually,
Sure.
so that I don't want to be disrespectful to people who took time to write something and that I just didn't have time to address.
Okay, what I'll do is I'll email you and CC them for the 2 that we didn't get to answer yet, and then
Perfect.
you can connect with them that way. But I just put my email in the chat, so I'll email everybody that's on this call if I have your email, the PowerPoints from Dr. Patel, and then if you're interested in signing up for the one-on-one consults, please email me and I'll get you on the schedule for that too. But thank you so much for your time today. It was so helpful, and thanks everybody for being on this call late. But I think it's all valuable information, and hopefully it was helpful to everybody.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me, and I look forward to more questions if you guys have them, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night.
Okay.